Thank you for coming. My name is Premilla Addison. I am the co-director, along with Janet Jacobson, of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Janet and I had a throwdown about who would get to do this welcome. I won. It's an honor for me to introduce this event, which is a celebration of Dr. Celia Naylor's newest book, Unsilencing Slavery, Telling Truths About Rosehall Plantation, Jamaica. Before I say a few words about the book, I have some acknowledgments. I want to name the multiple traumas and histories that enable us to be in this privileged space today. The theft of land from the original inhabitants, the Lenape people, and the stolen bodies and stolen labor of African people. But equally important, I want to recognize the movements, the struggles, and resistances that led to the necessary, if insufficient, land acknowledgements, and that unearthed the histories of slavery that are literally and figuratively foundational to colleges and universities. I also want to thank the many people who contributed to making this event possible. Sophie Kreetzberg, our postbac fellow, who took care of a lot of the logistics today. Avi Cummings. There's a lot of names, so I'm going to ask you to hold your applause. These are all fabulous people, but just hold your applause. Hope Dector, Miriam Neptune, Pam Phillips, Janet Jacobson, our RAs at BCRW, Nilu Cooper, Kelsey Kitsky, Sharmi Azurel, Kristen Santorin, ASL interpreters, yes. Andrea Alefi and Michael Milley from All Hands in Motion. And thanks also to Christian Delpin and Juliana Yu, who are helping us with AV, Kyle Cruz from Events Management, Jess Saldana from IMATS, and also to all the people who prepared our food for tonight, Jamaican food. We can look forward to that, as well as the Barnard College staff who helped set up and will clean up after us tonight, that invisible labor. We are here today to celebrate a masterly and moving new book by Celia Naylor. Unsilencing Slavery is a powerful intervention in how we understand, talk about, write about, represent enslaved people and their families and connections with one another. It is about historical memory, about absences in the archive, the multiple stories that are told, why particular stories are told, and the consequences of those stories. Celia analyzes how the afterlives of slavery are reflected in memorializations, stories, tourist sites, and the folklore around Rosehall Plantation. It is a book about recognition, recuperation, and reparation. Unsilencing Slavery, as Celia describes it, is a micro-history of enslaved people's experiences at Rosehall Plantation. One of the things I found most compelling is Celia's contention that we have to ask questions even if we don't have the answers. As she explained so eloquently, although there are things that we do not know and that we may never know, that shouldn't prevent us from asking and speculating and imagining. She draws on the threads of archival traces to weave what is in many ways a beautiful story in the cauldron of a brutal and horrific system. Celia does not just note silences, but digs deep into what those silences are. She asks us to imagine who the people listed in the Rosehall Journal were, how they lived, loved, and resisted, thus exceeding what the primary source was meant to convey. Celia brings to the limitations of the archive her breadth of historical knowledge, her creative and analytical skills, and an insightful, close reading to tell a story of a people who were kept in bondage at Rosehall and enabling the reader to contemplate their lives as full human beings. Today is not just a celebration of a book, but a project, and it includes a website that she created with a team of people from Barnard and Columbia, and I think we're going to have the website up at some point. Okay. It's called unsilencing-slavery.org, and I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. I also want to note that we have copies of the book for sale in the back of the room, and I want to thank Word Up for being here today. At Celia's request, I'm going to give a very brief formal introduction to her. She actually said, just use my name. Just tell them what my name is. Celia Naylor was born in Kingston, Jamaica. She migrated to the United States with her family in 1977. She's a professor of Africana Studies and History at Barnard College. Her first book, entitled African Cherokees in Indian Territory, From Chattel to Citizens, was published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2008. On a more personal note, I just want to say how happy I am that BCRW is able to host this event. Celia is a friend and a colleague to many of us here. And as many of you know, in addition to the brilliance that shines through in this book, she exhibits a generosity of spirit and unmatched collegiality. But she can also be a fierce and unrelenting advocate when necessary. So tonight, just to give you a little sense of what's going to happen, Celia is going to do a reading, and then we'll be in conversation with our also amazing colleague, Natasha Lightfoot. Natasha is an associate professor of history at Columbia who specializes in slavery and emancipation studies and Black identities, politics, and cultures in the fields of Caribbean, Atlantic world, and African diaspora history. She's the author of Troubling Freedom, Antigua and the Aftermath of British Emancipation. And her forthcoming book, which we are eagerly awaiting, is entitled Fugitive Cosmopolitans. So I will hand that over to the two of them. Or, I'm sorry, to Celia first.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening. So thanks to all of you, first and foremost, for being here today. A number of you are included in the very long acknowledgments in my book, and I won't go into too much of that, but just to thank everyone who's in the acknowledgments and here tonight. Even though Premila has already said some thank yous, I'm going to repeat a couple of them, if that's okay. So as with almost everything in life, right, it takes a village, right? It takes a village to bring together this event tonight, to organize it. And certainly the initial seed for this was actually Elizabeth Castelli. We were on a subway ride. A lot of this book was actually written on the subway, but we can get to that later. We were on a subway ride. She said, you know, you should really do some sort of event. And as Premila knows and others know, I said, absolutely not. I will not do that. Why would anybody want to do that? And so I denied her, and then Premila raised it again, and I accepted the invitation. So thank you, Premila, for being a wonderful colleague and a loving friend and encouraging me to do this. Thanks to Avi Cummings and all of the staff members involved in BCRW who also made this possible. I wanted to thank Christian as well for the tech, and Sophie for organizing so much of this as well. And of course, for everyone all the staff who were involved in setting this room up for us before we arrived, and will be here long after we have left, clearing it up. So thanks to them. Special thanks to Natasha Lightfoot for being willing to be in this conversation with me. And that also meant having to read the book or skimming it or something. Whatever you did is fine. We'll work with whatever you did. So it's okay. No shade one way or the other. And thanks again to you all. So as Primla mentioned, before we begin our conversation, I'm going to read about 10 minutes, might be a little bit shorter. It was longer this morning and I cut some. This is mostly from the introduction to the book. The White Witch of Rosehall, Annie Palmer, is remembered as a particularly notorious mistress whose lovers included both Englishmen and men enslaved on her plantation. Most stories emphasize her supposed numerous, heinous, and supernatural deeds, her being raised by a voodoo priestess in Haiti, her murdering 3 English husbands, her excessively brutal treatment of the people enslaved on her plantation, and, as legend goes, her ghost haunting the Rosehall Great House grounds today. These details of Annie Palmer's legend have circulated widely in Jamaica and throughout the world. Every year, more than 100,000 visitors attend and participate in the different tours of Rosehall. They're both daily and evening tours. Over the decades, visitors have shared pictures and stories, keeping the legend alive into the present day. The narrative in the Rosehall Great House tours materialized from Herbert G. de Lisser's 1929 novel entitled The White Witch of Rosehall. Due to limited extant historical information about Annie Palmer, de Lisser utilized the fertile ground of historical gaps to concoct this legend about a white witch. As a result, the only historical facts included in de Lisser's novel and in the Rosehall tours are that a woman named Annie Palmer lived at Rosehall between 1820 and 1830, and that she was the white mistress of Rosehall during those years. All other details, again, all other details about Annie Palmer described in the novel and the tours are entirely fictional. However, visitors mistakenly assume that the Rosehall Great House is a museum. Instead, it operates as a tourist site with fictional information presented as the history of the site, and in fact, the history of slavery at the site. Annie Palmer's mythical voice and presence remain pivotal throughout the tours, while enslaved women's experiences, voices, and presence are neglected, ignored, and silenced. At random moments during the tour, a couple of Black women appear seemingly out of nowhere, acting as ghosts of enslaved women engaged in household duties. How do their bodies simultaneously represent a palpable corporeal marker for slavery while serving as a neutralized, anesthetized tourist props? Why are the names of enslaved women and their actual lived experiences secretly cast into the shadows of the tours? Even though slavery's ritualized acts of terror and trauma are not presented during the daily tours, these silences surrounding the stories of enslaved people in the tours today become a contemporary form of perpetual violence reinscribed at the site of slavery. Even as the names and voices of enslaved women, such as Penella, Kate, Celia, and Peachy, remain stifled and silenced in the contemporary tours, the actual presence and experiences of enslaved women could not be entirely silenced. The first part of this book's title invokes Michel Rolfe-Trouillot's Silencing the Past, Power and the Production of History. And I emphasize the process of what I refer to as unsilencing slavery. To be clear, slavery was not a quiet, secretive, or silent institution. Rather, it was resounding and deafening in its private and public, covert and overt demonstrations of pain, power, terror, and trauma. In the notices of slave auctions and sales, in the regular, persistent, and often relentless advertisements for runaway slaves, in the accounting and calculations of the births and deaths of enslaved people, in the refusal to grant the most fundamental human rights and civic privileges to enslaved persons, and in the practice of brandings, whippings, maimings, rapes, and executions, as well as other forms of emotional, psychic, physical, and spiritual violations. The archives have often functioned and been deployed as a kind of historical cover for the depth and breadth of these violences. This project engages in the critical process of what Christina Sharp refers to as wake work. It is to begin to name those enslaved who have been unremembered and unmemorialized. It is to begin to reconstruct stories buried and deemed unworthy of telling and retelling. It is to begin to reimagine the struggles, suffering, and sanctity of people enslaved, though not entirely dehumanized. It is to begin to question the aftermath of slavery that is Rosehall in content and in form. And it is to begin to ask what and who survive at Rosehall in the mythical ghost haunting of a white witch, the pretense of memorialization, and the facade of slavery. In the literary and popular reincarnations of Annie Palmer, in de Lisser's novel and the contemporary tours at Rosehall, what and who serves as witnesses? What and who are being witnessed? And what and who are being remembered and forgotten? For what purposes related to the telling of the past, the living in the present, and the imaginings of the future? There will always be unanswered questions about the lived experiences of enslaved people. However, the questions we pose and the stories we imagine, consider, and tease out about their lives provide a vital lens in crafting a human and humane story of enslaved people. History-telling itself serves as a modality to express some sense of the fullness of enslaved people's spirits, the capaciousness of Black humanity, and the reclamation, affirmation, and declaration that enslaved Black lives mattered at Rosehall and at other plantations in the Americas. even as the overseers scribbled their brief notes in the Rosehall Journal as a way of accounting for the enslaved persons and their respective duties. Enslaved people at Rosehall were also noting, cherishing, and attending to their individual and collective thoughts, feelings, words, actions, realities, secrets, and dreams of freedom. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I just want to start by saying that this book is really wonderful, and I urge you all to really sit with it. It's not something that you should just skim through. I'm saying that because it really isn't, even though I also want to call you out on that, because I read, girl. Anyway, I just want to
She's
say,
very busy, just like everybody else, so we don't want to assume anything.
but truly, though, everyone should sit with it, because it is not an easy book, and it is not easy in some of the most enriching and, kind of arresting ways. So I kind of wanted to just start with the origin story of the book, because there's an interesting one that, that you begin with that I would love for the audience to hear. What inspired you to focus on Rosehall in the first place?
So it seems to me that anytime I'm about to write a book, I never actually begin with that idea. It comes from other places. With the first book, it was a class, my first class at Duke, and I wrote a paper, and then that paper became a longer paper, became a dissertation, became the book. And at Duke, what I wanted to do was to work on a book, a dissertation about enslaved women in Jamaica. That was many, many moons ago. So in 2013, so it's been almost 10 years now, I took my daughter, who was 13 at the time, to Jamaica. And it was her first time there. I'd been there, since leaving in '77 many times. But I thought it was about time that she actually visited, and I wanted to be the one to take her. So being that she was 13, I knew I would have to come up with some things that a 13-year-old might actually enjoy. And, for some of us, it's different. So I saw this, and I'd heard about Rosehall growing up in Kingston, right, and about the White Witch, though I don't really know that I knew anything beyond that. We never went as a family to this tour, to this plantation. So we went, so she loves ghost stories. So I said, okay, let's go to the evening performance of this thing and see this tour. And so the whole time I'm going through the tour, and I'm just like, this is ridiculous. This is crazy. I can't believe they're doing this. And she's just like, can you stop? Can you stop? And I'm like, no, this is ridiculous. Oh, that's even more ridiculous now. And she was just having a hard time. Now, she and everybody else thoroughly enjoyed this tour, right? And it still remains one of her favorite moments of that time. But anyway, and I left the tour thinking, really just could not believe that this was actually something that happened every day, several times a day. And I think what bothered me most as I thought about the story was that this is a particular tour that school children in Jamaica go through as a way to introduce them to slavery in Jamaica. And so for me, that was particularly disturbing, right? I mean, certainly tourists coming and the entertainment of it all, right? And the way it's presented, it is very entertaining, was problematic in and of itself, but knowing that this was a field trip, right, for students to learn about slavery in Jamaica. So that's how it started, and I didn't think I would, I hoped that I would be able to come up with a few names in some archives, right? I thought I might be able, initially I thought I'd be able to write a poem. That's actually how it started. And then I said, well, maybe a short essay. And then eventually it became this book. But I am as surprised about it now as I was then. Yeah.
So I'm going to go into some scholarly interventions and start with how you think in the intro, because in the intro you're sort of invoking and kind of working through the scholarship of a number of Black studies and Black feminist theorists. So of course Trio, as you mentioned, and Sharp, as you mentioned, Toni Morrison at points, Saidiya Hartman, Marisa Fuentes, among others, to articulate and address what can be, I think, best described as the absent presence of enslaved people in Rosehall's archives. And you contend with, at length, and sort of disrupt the presentations, the representations that enslaved people are, receiving in the context of this, documentation. How does your work sort of sit with and try to think through these silences, these absences, these presences in the company of these scholars?
Yeah, I would say that, again, when I started working on this book, it was unclear to me what sort of stories I'd be able to tell, that I wasn't sure, as with so many cases, and I'm not alone or exceptional in this, when you begin the project, if it is on slavery, and you're specifically thinking about enslaved persons in it, that you realize you're going to be dealing with a lot of challenges in terms of the silences of the archives. I would say, too, and I want to just say this one thing and then come back to it, that it was really important to me to look at what was present both in the archives in Jamaica, in Spanish Town, as well as the archives in England. And part of that was that there are some scholars who actually don't look at the archives in many of these countries, right, but instead go solely to England or to Spain or to Portugal, right, or to France. And so it was important to me to make sure to explore both, right, what was there in both places. I mentioned Christina Sharp, and I think that for me, and I include this quote in the book as well, but I was at this conference and a scholar talked about how to tell a human story, right, in a humane way about crimes of humanity, right? And that continued to inspire me and motivate me, right? That it wasn't, in fact, only about trying to write the names of these people, though that was really the only objective I had. There are a couple of people who are mentioned in the tours. Taku is one, and the people who are mentioned were never enslaved people. Again, these are all fictional names. And so I wanted to have those names, and it was also important to me to try to see if I could think about ways to tell stories that one could only imagine about their experiences, right? So in the book, I spend a great deal of time talking about Dorinda, and she's the midwife at Rosehall, one of the midwives. During the time that I'm looking at, 1817 to 1832, Dorinda had at least 9 children, and half of those children passed before the age of 5. So for me, it was like, what does it mean for Dorinda to be in a position where she is, one, possibly dealing with the grief of the children and mourning those children who had passed, as well as trying to assist other women, and maybe some of those women she liked, maybe she didn't like some of those women, right? And what does it mean for her to be in that situation over and over and over again, to be helping with childbirth? Mm-hmm. And there's a point where Dorinda actually runs away, and it's said that she ran away because of neglect of duty, right? And it's like, what do we imagine with that, right? What could have happened why she chose to run away for a short period of time, right? Was it really a neglect of duty, her not following through on something? Was it a way for her to just get some measure of peace away from the plantation, right? For a day, just for a day, right? So I wanted to think about the different layers of meanings and significance that we often don't stop to sit with and abide with, right? And to imagine not necessarily what Dorinda felt or thought, but at least to imagine the complexities of her situation, to imagine the contradictions even of being a midwife at Rosehall during that time.
Wow. Thank you for that. There are a million different ways that I could follow that up. I have a lot of questions for you already, but I'm going to stick to what I've thought about, but we have long talks ahead. So I wanted to also talk about, interestingly, the other tour that's happening in the book, which I feel, you kind of articulate right at the start of the first chapter, where ultimately you're trying to tour us as readers through the archives. And we journey alongside you and read with you, rather than you giving what tends to happen in a lot of historical monographs, which is a sweeping narrative, where the archive comes in and out. You kind of privilege the fact that there is a certain kind of sparseness, that you have an abundance of names, an abundance of roles, an abundance of, information about the functioning of Rosehall as a plantation. And so you get the contours and the contents and your understanding of both the effects intended and unintended of how the archive is set up. And I feel like in many ways you're making a move discursively that sort of builds on and maybe pushes a little bit further past what Stephanie Smallwood does with the ledger in saltwater slavery. Because I think you're also trying to introduce this wealth of possibilities for imagining their lives, the lives of the enslaved people, through these plausible but very much unanswerable questions. And I think there's something distinct about these methodologies here that I want you to talk about.
Yeah, I was in a recent class with another colleague who teaches at the University of Virginia, and a student asked about my methodologies in this, and how important that is. And certainly for you, Marisa, and many others in the room, that these are guides that we utilize, right? And I'll say what I said to the student. I said, I actually wasn't thinking about any methodologies at the time, right? The only methodology that was the guide for me, right? And certainly, reading so many other scholars who have really tried and grappled with some of these issues, that the methodology I used was just to keep coming back to enslaved people, right? So I initially thought, well, the way I was introduced to this was through the tour, so shouldn't I begin the book there, right? And I decided against that. I decided I was going to begin with the archives. And as you said, the sparseness of it, and also the richness of it. And instead of solely just going through page after page, there were about 1,000 pages, handwritten pages, of a Rosehall journal. And this was a journal that had daily and weekly notes about what enslaved people were doing on the plantation, in various parts of the plantation. And the only times that names were actually mentioned of enslaved people was when a woman gave birth, and sometimes that child would be named. And there were notes if there were miscarriages as well. When someone passed, and sometimes there was a mention about how possibly they passed, and when individuals ran away. So those were the specific moments, and there were a few others, but sort of the usual moments where people's actual names were mentioned. But for the most part, it was, the first gang did this, right? The second gang did this. The first gang being the most healthy, the younger enslaved people on the plantation. And oftentimes when people think about that first gang, they imagine enslaved men. And in fact, the majority of people who were working in the sort of arduous aspects of the agricultural dimensions of sugar cultivation were actually young girls and women on this plantation at Rosehall and in many other plantations throughout the Americas. So it was important, you know, from just the first gang, you might not recognize that, right? And then when I looked at other archival materials, and one being a clothing allowance. Every year there was a clothing allowance, and it included the specific positions of enslaved people on the plantation. And over 90% of the people who were listed as field worker were women. Right? And so, again, you know, trying to just piece together the various pieces of the archives and looking at them side by side, but also thinking about them in conversation with each other, right? And so that, I would say that was part of the driving methodology, is how do we think about the complexities and the nuances within the archives themselves, and then how do we enter into that? Yeah. What is how do we position ourselves in terms of the archives? What is it we're actually looking for, right? What is it that we expect to find? Yeah. And can we be surprised by what we find? And can we tell a story about that too?
I also wanted to just mention how, you know, how special it was to read you declare every enslaved person at Rosehall as special. And I noticed that every single enslaved person that you encounter in the archive is named somewhere in the text, if not multiple times. Every name is called regardless of if the only info we really have on them is maybe their name, their occupation, and nothing else, right? Or maybe just one sort of entry. And it reminded me a lot of Norbesi Phillips' song and the litany for the dead that she offers. I kind of feel like, you know, there's just a lot of weight to what you're doing. So I wanted to hear you kind of speak about what that, you know, what that does for you, that work of sort of having to provide this litany to commune with the spirits, the real spirits, as opposed to the fake ghosts, let's say, right?
Yeah, at one point I was like, well, the people who are actually haunting this, they're not, you know, Annie Palmer or John Rose Palmer. It's the enslaved people, if there's anyone who's haunting this site. I don't know that I can explain how important it was to me, still is, to have every single person named in those archives appear in the book. And I think one of the reasons for the website was really to pull the stories of these individuals together, to think about them as individuals, but also to think about a community or communities of people, right? So on the website, there is a list of the 208 individuals that I identified, right? And some of those people lived into their 70s. Some of those people died when they were 2 or 3 days old. And that it was important for me on the website, and this is something that I don't necessarily think comes across as well in the book, if I could say that, which is why I had the website, that I wanted to have something written, some narrative, some small story, right, written for each person. And so that you find on the website, right? So there's some people like Dorinda who's mentioned a lot, and then others who are mentioned quite briefly. And I wanted each to have a space, right, in the book and also on the website, that would bring them together so that we don't necessarily always see them as individual people, right, though certainly they were, but for us to at least imagine relationships of all kinds, right? Not necessarily only friendships, right? But certainly the full spectrum of what might have been there for them. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk about the work of privileging the experiences of women at Rosehall, because I felt like what you did reflected the violently gendered contours of racial capitalism. We see women having to die too soon from the dangers of childbirth while enslaved, women being bio mothers, women being other mothers, watching children live and die too soon. You do a lot to put us in the view of this very precarious and yet, kind of undeniably present motherhood and kinship in the chapter that you especially, in the second chapter, where this work is especially brought forth. And I would love for you to talk to the audience about what that chapter looks like and kind of the decisions you made on how to present that story to us.
So one of the decisions that I made is that I wanted to talk about many of the women in terms of their generational spaces. And to think about, for some of these women who, and again, I was looking from 1817 to 1832, though certainly many of the people had lived and labored at Rosehall before 1817. And lived past 1832, right? But in terms of the archival records. And it was clear to me that when I looked at the groupings of women according to the decades, right? So starting from the young children who were 3 and 4 and 5 when they started with their duties, right, on the plantation. And that group was often very mixed in terms of gender, right? Often called the hog meat gang, right? And that they were doing different duties, right? Picking up trash, helping with harvesting, that sort of thing, at 3, 4, 5, 6 years of age. And then I looked at some of the women who were in their 50s and 60s, and many of the women who were in their 60s were African-born. And certainly that was another dimension that I wanted to think about, right? What did it mean for so many of these women who were African-born? And part of the reason we know that is because it's recorded in the slave registries, right? Whether they're African-born or Creole, and Creole meant that they could have been born in Jamaica, but really it was they weren't African-born, right? They could have been born in Cuba, they could have been born in Brazil and made their work and been forcibly relocated, right, to Jamaica. They could have been born in other parts of Jamaica and ended up at Rosehall. So Creole is a fairly expansive term, just as expansive as African-born, right? So I was interested in presenting sort of these African-born women and who were older and what they were perhaps sharing with each other and also with the other women who were older who were Creole, right? And then what is it that they passed on to their children who were all Creole, right, born there? And so thinking about the exchange of knowledge, the production of knowledge before arrival in Jamaica or in the Americas, and then also what is shared, what is perhaps not shared, right? What is kept as sacred, what is kept as safe individually, or what is shared communally as something that is, if I want to use the word, the property for everyone to engage in. So I was interested in the women specifically because of what they were passing down. And I should say this, that in the records, as a result of particular juridical codes in Jamaica and in other parts of the Americas, that only the names of, for Rosehall, only the names of enslaved women who were mothers, right, are included as mothers. So in the record, there would be Celia, right? And then Delia, daughter or granddaughter of Celia, right? The sort of matrilineage would be mentioned. But I would not know who Delia's father was. I wouldn't know who Penella's father was, or Kate's, or any of them, right? There are a couple references that I make to possible men being fathers, both enslaved men as well as white overseers, right? And partly we know some of that because the color of individuals is also included, right? Negro, mulatto, quadroon, etc. So it was important for me to think about these women as individuals, but also how they were sharing their lives together in not only in spaces of work, right, but also in intimate moments that were not necessarily viewed by others. There's a part where I mentioned, you know, what might some of these mothers have done who were breastfeeding in the morning? How might they have attended to their children, right? And what might that have looked like individually and perhaps even collectively? Unlike other plantations, the women at Rosehall did not actually breastfeed the children of Annie Palmer, because Annie Palmer, as far as we know, did not have any children. Right? So that part was, there was nothing to be added there in terms of Annie Palmer herself. But thinking about breastfeeding, and certainly Sasha Turner and many others have written beautiful works about enslaved women and motherhood. So it wasn't necessarily about repeating that, though I mentioned Sasha throughout and her work, but it was about thinking about the broader historical context and then placing these women within it. Right? And centering their humanity. I suppose that would have been, yeah, that's part of it for me. Yeah.
So when you mentioned Sasha, before I ask my last question, I just want to call you out because you set a boundary where you say that this book, you know, doesn't offer any implications for broader Jamaican history or the history of Caribbean slavery regionally. I just want to say no. No to that. Actually, you are absolutely in the canon. You are in the conversation. So don't, you know, just mentioning Sasha, I wanted to say, yeah, alongside Sasha and Colleen Vasconcelos and all the other folks who are giving important work, you're offering something really important to the conversation. But anyway.
Thank you for that.
Last question. So especially in chapters 4 and 5, when you look at the Lisser's text and you look at the distortions of the Rosehall sort of edifice, and how it's, you know, kind of incorporated so sort of, you know, kind of deeply into what is tourism and heritage in Jamaica, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation. I wanted to sort of ask about what exactly you would want the current owners, the white family from Delaware that owns Rosehall, to know about their piece of property that they don't know. And what do you envision as something of a better way for Rosehall to sort of do a different job telling this story? Like, you know, kind of, would you want the owners or the folks who manage and operate the tours to pick up Unsilencing slavery and maybe do a little revision?
Perhaps, maybe, right? Maybe that might have been in the back of my head, too. So let me say this. I remember when I first started writing this book, at Rosehall, there's a gift shop where there are books and different things sold, soaps, etc. And a friend of mine was like, you know, your book never going to go sell in this place, right? I was like, no, it's not going into this gift shop. I'm like, I get that. that. All right. So knowing that.
Never know. Never say
No,
never.
no, yeah, right. I never, yeah. I want to say, though, that I actually reached out to the Rollins family several times. Michelle Rollins in particular, who is, once her husband passed, John Rollins, she's the person who has been the primary caretaker of the business. As she's getting older, she's now passing it on to their children, and to others as well, but primarily to the children. And so I called, I sent an email, I sent letters, I left messages, because I actually wanted to have a conversation, at least with her or someone in the family. Unfortunately, they didn't respond to any of those, right? Shocking. I did not wait with bated breath for a response, but I was hopeful still, actually, that they might, and I'm still hopeful about that. Whenever I would go, and I've been through the tours at least a dozen times now, and whenever I would go, the women who, often women, I've only had women tour guides, though I've seen a couple of men. They would always, they've seen me a number of times, so they would be like, really though? Really? This is all fictional? Like, all of this, but she killed the husbands, right? That's real. I'm like, no. But she went to Haiti, right? And she did all this voodoo, right? No, that's not.
She wasn't a witch.
So, because this is what, you grow up with, right? As being factual, right?
Part of national lore.
National lore, right?
Yeah.
And so I always tried not to have those conversations in front of the tourists, because that wasn't necessarily what they had signed up for.
Right,
so
exactly.
usually it was before or after, right? I'm like, keep that to yourself. Right, exactly. That's not, So I would still hope, and I would say this, one of the managers, who is a Jamaican woman of the Rosehall Great House, she and I have talked a lot, and she really wants to do a lot more. So over the last 2 years, they've created a couple of posters in the lower area of the Great House. And there's nothing really about slave. Like, there's one on Johnny Cash, because he has a home. One of his homes is a plantation home. So, and he was close friends with John Rollins, who's the person who bought all of this property, the 6,000.
American neocolonialism in the Caribbean.
Johnny Cash also has a song about Annie Palmer. So there, like, all these. So there's something about reggae. There's and she wanted to add more about slavery, and the Rollins family said no, right? So I'm still hopeful that there will be some possibilities. I don't want to say, maybe with the younger generation, because that doesn't mean anything whatsoever. Right, correct. So but I'm still hopeful that there might be some more added, just because this manager is really dedicated to that. And I think she's going to continue to bring it up over and over and over. And the tour guides want more. They've brought it up over the years and been denied, right? That we're not going to include that. The way that I will probably spin it, if I have an opportunity, is to say, look, you can keep this tour, but you could create another tour, and you might double your money. Right. So to think about it within capitalist notions, right, with capitalist motivations, because the tour is 20 to 25 US dollars, right? So they're making quite a bit of money on this, as well as, there's a whole, met somebody recently, and he was like, I so enjoyed, though, being on the White Witch golf course. I can't go back there anymore. And I was like, you're free to do whatever you want to do, right? So there are different ways that this is presented, and
the White Witch golf course.
Yes.
My
yes.
God.
Yep. So all of that is in there, right? As well as hotels and that sort of thing.
It's a tourist
It's a
enterprise.
tour, right? Yeah. And I was going to say, this is thousands of acres, right? And so and this is also a place where they have weddings, and they make quite a bit of money off of that as a destination wedding. So that's a good chunk of the money, as I understand it, comes from that.
Wow, wow.
So,
Well, I have so much more to ask, but I want to stop here, and I guess we're going to open it out to the audience for any questions that you may have.
I was
So
going to
this-
say, as we do this, I just wanted to mention one of the things that I did purposefully, and it's something that I actually do in my class on Caribbean women, is that I focus on Caribbean scholars who are scholars of color throughout the book. And most of the scholars who are not of color actually end up in the footnotes. Everybody's in the footnotes, but many scholars who are not of color end up there, because there's also a way that scholars of color in their work on the Caribbean and in so many other places have not been cited properly, have not been included, have also been silenced in their own ways.
Yeah.
And so that was important. And the last thing, I think we're going to get to, is I wanted to mention, when I thought it was done, and then we were working on, I sent the bibliography, and we were trying to figure out with the index, and you can hand this over to somebody. So the indexer sent me the index, and I was like, okay, that's not going to do. We're going to have to include the names of enslaved people in the index too.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
he was like, well, how's that going to work? And I was like, no. He was like, so we're just going to have the first name, like, Celia or Kate or whatever. And I was like, yeah. And he's like, okay, I'll just add Palmer, right, to their name. And so they have a full name. And I was like, no, we're going to do it just as it appears. Some people had a last name, and sometimes it was Palmer, but we're not going to do that. So it was interesting, even in that experience and process of the indexing, to think about that. And he was like, it's going to seem weird. And I was like, it's okay. It's okay. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
Right.
It's going to be okay. You're still getting paid. Don't worry about
There
it.
we go.
So anyway, I wanted to mention that.
Thank you. So, yes.
Hello, this is on?
Is it? Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for writing this book. The United States has done is now failing to keep slavery out of our lips and through literature. And it has always been a topic that has been close to my heart. I grew up in Harlem 10, 12 years before the Brown case, and white kids used to tell me that God freed them and Lincoln freed me. And in that light, I came to become really desirable to learning how these things happened, and here I am. So I go to a lot of which is why, by the way, I'll throw this in, why I don't celebrate Juneteenth, because I believe that we were born free anyway. We don't need to celebrate what's mine anyway. And I'm certainly not going to attach it to a war that means that didn't free me. So what I want to say is that I have followed, I have paralleled your talk and what you have said, and I got a book too, with my learning of the Tulsa race riots. To me, there was an enormous parallel, and my mentor, like a father to me, somebody that I loved and would visit, and he would come to my house, Dr. John Hope Franklin, taught me how to read history, how to understand it. He was the one that got me to think about the Reconstruction and Juneteenth, and really taught me that that the Reconstruction, it's not 1877, it still hasn't happened, and we should wait for a black person to say when it closed. So I mean, there's so much history, and living and
Still
being with
waiting.
Dr. Franklin
Right.
has done it. So your parallel situation, I've written books on it also. So it's so enlightening to hear you talk, and I wish that young people would be more courageous in interpreting our history as ours, as not as something that was given to us that we have to write, and this is how it was. And Dr. Franklin gave me a lot of his books, the important ones before he passed away. And hearing you is marvelous, and it's great. I'm an activist also, and at that place I would have said what you said in front of the tourists. So, that's why I get arrested a lot.
Yeah.
So again, thank you.
I get
for so
arrested in
much.
other places, but I haven't.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
Going to the tour.
And if you could sign my book later on, but I really appreciate these stories, and we got to keep going. We got to keep going. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And if possible, please share, your work, and I'd love to read that as well. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay. Love, yes. I appreciate you also bringing John Hope Franklin into the room. And I had the pleasure of meeting him a couple of times, and such a generous and graceful spirit. And I would say, I met him actually because his grandfather talks about him in the WPA interviews. And with my first book, that was sort of the center of it. And so we talked about that in Oklahoma and that sort of thing, and what it meant for him to do the work that he did, right, in segregated spaces in Washington, D.C. and in other parts, right? Where he wasn't allowed to enter some spaces because he was African American. So I appreciate you bringing him into the room. It's him and his orchids, and his wife and the orchids, yeah. Yes. The other thing I want to pick up on that you mentioned that is really important too is how we often frame notions of freedom. And we often mistakenly, think about emancipation or abolition as being synonymous with freedom. And that is the first mistake. There are many. And the other is thinking about people who are enslaved as not recognizing that with a thought that they are free. Yes. Right? That somebody else is claiming that they're human property, right? But that it wasn't necessary for somebody to run away or to commit some other crime on these plantations in order to demonstrate their understanding of their freedom. That simply waking up and recognizing that this person may see you as property, but you are a free person, right? And so it's important to recognize the capaciousness of freedom, which we still haven't achieved in many ways in terms of the juridical laws that we deal with today in the US and elsewhere. But to recognize that freedom isn't only about the laws, right? And that freedom really is a state of mind that then is extended and projected in what we feel, in the words we use, the actions we take, right? And to recognize the largeness of it. And really the ways that it cannot actually be limited, right? Then or now, yeah? So I appreciate you bringing freedom into the room too, yeah.
Okay, I wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to ask about the differences, the differences between the archives in Jamaica and the archives in Europe. Because you said you thought it was important to visit both.
Yeah. So I'll actually begin, thank you, Professor Moore. I'll actually begin with the ways that the archives in Jamaica are often presented. And that is, the archives are in Spanish Town. And Spanish Town is often known as, it's about 30 minutes, 40 minutes bus ride from Kingston. So I often took the bus, just a local bus to Spanish Town, which aggravated my family and friends to no end because they saw this as really dangerous, right? And so oftentimes when I would arrive in the morning, other scholars would be having drivers bring them in, right? And then wait for them until the end of the day and then drive them back to Kingston. I chose not to do that. One, because I really wanted to get a sense of Spanish Town itself. And to also get a sense of the people, the archivist, right? Sometimes I would be sitting there and there would be some scholars who would come in and treat them as if they were their servants, just in very disrespectful ways, right? So I mentioned that just to think about just the space itself, getting to and from, as well as just the interactions and the hierarchies that are presented in archives too. Most of the archivists in Spanish Town are women, and many of the people who were scholars who were visiting from often England and other parts of the UK were often older white men, right? So sort of the dynamics of that, right? So one of the things that's different is that the Rosehall Journal was there in Spanish Town, but it was not in Kew in England, right? And that's where I actually started thinking about these individuals as individuals, right? When I was reading through this journal. And I think the journal opens up so many different opportunities for engaging with, what Stephanie Smallwood does in terms of saltwater slavery, right? And these ledgers, as well as just like thinking about the ledgers, but looking beyond the ledgers as well, So that was one major difference, was that the Rosehall Journal was there, and had I been only focused on being in England and looking at the archives there, I may never have found and read through this Rosehall Journal. I'm still trying to work with the archives to get the whole thing online in some way. And it's a struggle, and I mentioned this too, because they want people to come, right? And so if it's online, then people might not, for that, as well as any other archival material that's there. And there's also a budgeting thing, but sort of people pay to make copies, and so it's important for people to come and make copies and help to sustain the archives, right? If it's online, that defeats some of the purpose. So that's one major difference. And the other thing I would say, the slave registries, which were these triennial lists of enslaved people, not only at Rosehall and throughout Jamaica, Jamaican plantations, but in other parts as well. Again, from 1817 for Jamaica to 1832, that these were both available, not all of them, so some were available in Spanish Town and others were available in Kew Garden, right, in England, in the National Archives there. So again, it was important to visit both, and some were incomplete in one space but complete in another. So I finally was able to get the complete registries of all of those, but it really meant that I had to go to both places. And with Q, as Marisa and others know, it's a new person you're dealing with every time, right? So some people love it because it's in this beautiful space and there's a wonderful, is it a lake or a pond or something with swans? Yeah. And there's a cafe and, all of this. And when I'm in Spanish Town, I'm going outside, checking to see anybody got a patty I could eat or whatever around. Like, I'm just, it's like, I bring some food, but it's, it's not a whole lot. Like, there's no cafe like that, no bountiful cafe. So it's, yes, colonial space in many ways. And so yes. So it different in so many ways. And even in Q, when you ask for something, it arrives, you look at it, there's no real engagement with people. At least I haven't, you try, but they're trying to do their job and get to the next person. Whereas, in Spanish Town, we're having conversations about some of what I'm finding. They're interested in that. They're interested in helping me as well find other materials. So it's just a very different interaction too. And I think that's also part of the archival experience, right?
So first I want to say hi, Professor Naylor and Professor Lightfoot. I took your classes like almost 10 years ago now.
It's been a long time, yes.
Yeah, I feel old.
You think you feel old. No, I'm kidding. Everybody else is getting old, but have you noticed?
Right, I agree.
It's a great thing. Okay.
So you mentioned that students in Jamaica often get an introduction into slavery by going to Rosehall Mansion. My cousin and I were Jamaican. We went back 2 years ago and went there, and I'm not gonna lie, we were eaten up. Those stories are captivating. They were like, they killed this one in this room, in that room. So I was engaged, and they tell it in a very believable way. So I'm just wondering, what is your vision for bringing the truths in the story to primary and secondary education in Jamaica, if any? I know that the Caribbean Students Association here always had this mission about developing a critical consciousness in students in the Caribbean at a very young age. So I'm wondering if you have a vision around this information reaching those classrooms.
Yes. Thank you so much for being here and for the question as well. Sorry.
Yeah, you can't answer until you get the other one.
Sorry. I don't follow instructions well.
It's okay. We still love you.
So my question has to do with the,
Go further. Go further.
my question has to do with the multi-format of this project.
Yes.
So you have the book, it started as a poem, you have the website, and I was just interested to hear you talk about how did having the access, or how did having the broader project affect the writing of the book, or you're thinking about what a book does now? Hi, thank you. Everyone is grateful for this book, and I'm among them. So I guess I'm connecting a few of the last threads. I was thinking about your point about perpetual violence that enabled slavery, and then the absent silences, and then I guess the last couple of threads about the archive and the way that, I guess I'm thinking about how the way Jamaica thinks about slavery. So I think this follows up on this last question about the education. So I just looked it up. I said, when did slavery end in Jamaica? It's 1838, is that right? When it begins?
Yeah, that's the end of the indentureship period.
Yeah.
Is 1838.
Yeah.
So it's 1833 that the Abolition Act is passed in England to take effect in 1834, and then there's 4 years of indentureship.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking that up really quickly because my point is to try to think about how Jamaicans are framing slavery, and so my dad is Jamaican, and so we often do this comparison of, how slavery is remembered in the United States versus Jamaica, and one of the points he always makes is, well, Jamaica is a majority black country, so we can do different things, and I'm like, And so, to your point about loud silences, so I'm wondering if you could say more about, and I say this with all due respect around, thinking about how black people are positioning themselves to navigate a still violent space, but the complicity of Jamaicans in still allowing something like this to be part of their national narrative. And so I'm wondering what the politics are in Jamaica around the remembrance of slavery, and how this book perhaps intervenes in the remembrance in the diaspora more broadly, and the ways that we still struggle to make visible, to make audible these loud silences.
Thank you so much for those great questions, in addition to your great questions, Natasha. So we didn't talk about the questions beforehand, so it was wonderful to experience them here and now. So I love that. So I'm going to try to do something that, as people say, my texts are paragraphs, right? I'm just not. My friends are like, people don't write just a sentence, a blurb. I mean, really? A paragraph? Who wants to read that? So, okay. That's how it starts, but let me try. One, in terms of education, one of the things that I've started is a couple family members are connected in terms of the Ministry of Education there. And so we're going to, later on this year, set up some meetings with me and some of the staff members there to see what we can do. And it's not so much that I want the students to read the book. It's just how can we change some of the narratives, right, regarding slavery in Jamaica that they're presented with, and using Rosehall as a particular site for that, sort of like a trajectory for that, right? Maybe even a catalyst for thinking around what is presented in popular culture and what students may have heard about, right? The White Witch, if they haven't even been there. And how do we approach that, right? Because there is certainly, and this gets a little bit in terms of, Angie, your question, you know, like in the United States and in many parts of the world, there is still a great deal of the stigmatization of slavery, right? Some might say the shame of slavery, right? And not wanting to connect with that, not wanting to remember that. So in Jamaica, for many decades now, there's been the celebration of Emancipation Day. And currently, and for different times, it was different moments in August, and anyway, August 1st, right? And August 6th is Independence Day, right, for Jamaica, August 6, 1962. So what is happening now is there's Emancipendence, which is a combination. It's a week beginning with Emancipation Day and then going through to Independence Day. But in the Jamaica Gleaner, sort of the major Gleaner in Kingston, there are a lot of people who have written in saying, we need to stop with Emancipation Day because that just brings up the history of slavery, right? And so it's gone back and forth in terms of that, right? Something like Independence Day, right, is seen as something much more positive and affirmative, but Emancipation Day is seen as something shameful, right? Even to today, like some of the Gleaner articles I was looking at, 2020, 2021, it was still the same thing about why we have to keep, mentioning Emancipation Day.
Celia, can I add to that really quickly? CARICOM, the Caribbean community of former British colonies in the Caribbean, has a reparations movement, and there's constant debate as well in many of the regional newspapers. I'm from Antigua, and I write about Antigua. So much debate about why. Why do we have a reparations movement? Maybe we should move on. There's a seductiveness of sort of forward movement, and part of a national narrative, a sort of like that kind of liberal narrative of like every time we move forward in history, we're always getting better, which obviously that's something we want to throw lots of question marks at. Right. But this is, I think, all part of it. Like, let's divorce emancipation from independence. Independence is what moves Jamaica forward, but not emancipation, right?
And, part of it is that we don't even recognize the ways that that independence, again, like notions of freedom, right, is so often compromised because of imperial relations with the United States and other parts, right?
Every single British Caribbean independence act and the creation of a constitution, it's actually all acts of parliament.
Yes, correct.
Let's be clear.
Yes.
Like the literal writing of constitutions in the British West Indies was all acts of parliament, not people in the island writing their own constitutions and declaring themselves fully independent as such. So we can start a whole other conversation about this.
I will do a little shout out to Barbados in terms of their recent, couple of years ago, deciding that they were no longer going to see, whether it's Queen or now soon to be King, as the head of state, right? And so, those kinds of symbolic and substantial,
just
right,
get the Queen off the paperwork, do a little something.
So anyhow, but so just to wrap up, I mean, getting to the ways that slavery, within the United States and certainly outside in various parts of the Americas, et cetera, sort of the amnesia of that too, right? And thinking about the work that's done right, in the forgetting, in the purposeful forgetting, right? And so even today when we're grappling with, and certainly, professors too, in colleges and universities, but even thinking about the attacks on critical race theory, right? And so how that also feeds into a particular kind of narrative about the United States, about slavery, about black people in the US, about people of color in the United States, and whose history and histories are valued, whose histories are devalued and discounted, right? And how that also connects so much with the disposability of black lives and black bodies, right? So that these things are not, separate and apart, but these are different manifestations and iterations, right, of ideas about black people not mattering, right, in the past, and then how we come to demonstrate that over and over and over again in the current day, right? So it's important to think about the laws, the different policies, what students are learning, right, in kindergarten all the way up, and to also realize what are we teaching ourselves, what are we educating young people and ourselves about, right, regarding black history and really about black people. And it's about, as I mentioned too in the book, and I'll say here, the ongoing case, right, the relentless ongoing case for black humanity.
Yeah.
Right? So I think all of those are really important in terms of schools and outside of school too, right? Mm-hmm. How we see ourselves and how we present ourselves and the totality of who we really are, right? Rather than the limited, scarce, sparse notions about black people. So.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.